ये जाएगी ना जैनब जाएगी ना जैनब के साथ चली जाना अभी जब जैनब जाएगी तो आप भी चलो
اللهم كن وليك المبتدئ السلام صلواتك عليه في هذا الساعة في كل ساعة وليا وحافظا مرادا ناصرا ودليلا معينا حتى تسأل بركته وتمتعه فيما تميلا بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم السلام عليك يا عباد الله السلام عليك يا ابن رسول الله السلام عليك يا خيرة الله وابن سيدك السلام عليك يا ابن أمير المؤمنين وابن سيد المسيحين السلام عليك يا ابن فاطمة سيدة النساء العالمين السلام عليك يا الله والمتمم السلام عليك وعلى حلت بثنائك عليكم نبي كريما سلام الله أبدا ما رضيت وبغي الليل والنهار يا رب الله يا رب الله لقد عظمت الرزية وجلت عظمت المصيبة بك علينا وعلى نبينا السلام وجلت عظمت مصيبة في السماوات على جميع السماوات فلعن الله متى أسست أساس الظل والجور عليكم أهل البيت ولعن الله متى نفعتكم الملائكة وزادتكم من مراتبكم التي عتبكم الله فيها ولعن الله متى عتبكم ولعن الله المهدين لهم بالتمكين للقتال فرحت إلى الله عليكم منهم ومن أشياء الواتقان يا الله أكبر يا الله أكبر إني سلمت لنا سعادتكم وحرمت لنا أنواركم لا يوم القيامة ولعن الله الذين آمنوا ولعن الله بني من يتغافل ولعن الله ابن مرجان ولعن الله سعد ولعن الله شقا ولعن الله أمتان أسرج والجمال تنقلت القتال كاميا تغني لقد عظم صاحبك فأسأل الله الذي يكرم مقامك ويكرمني بك أن يرزقني طلب الصالح مع عبادة منصور من أهل بيت محمد صلى الله عليه وآله اللهم اجعلني عندك مجيبا الحسين عليه السلام في الدنيا والآخرة يا الله يا الله إني أتقرب إلى الله وإلى رسوله وإلى آله المؤمنين وإلى فاطمة وإلى الحسن وإليك بمراتك وبالباطل النبات والصلاة وبالباطل من السلسلة والجنة وقال الله إلى رسوله ممن أسس أساس الأرض وبنى عليه بنيانا وجرى في قدمه وجمعه عليكم على أشياء فليجعل الله عليكم منهم وتقرب إلى الله ثم إليكم بموالاة وموالاة وليكم وبالبعض من أعلامكم والناصبين لكم الحال وبالبعض من أشياءكم وأتباعكم إني سلمون لنا سعادتكم وحرمون لنا أموالكم ووليون لنا أموالكم وتقول لنا أعداءكم فأسأل الله الذي يكرمني بمعرفتكم ومعرفة أوليائكم ورزقني الدعوات النعماءكم أن يجعلني معكم في الدنيا والآخرة وأن يثبتني عندكم بدن صدق في الدنيا والآخرة وأسأله أن يبلغ المقام المحمود لكم عند الله وأن يرزقني كان الثاني مع إمام الهدى ظاهر ناصر بالحق منكم وأسأل الله لكم وبالشكل الذي لكم عنا أن يعطيني مصابيبكم أفضل ما يعطي مصابا من مصيبة ما رمضان وأعظم رزقية ما في الإسلام وفي جميع السماوات والأرض اللهم اجعلني في مقامي هذا ممن تنال منه صلوات ورحمة ومغفرة اللهم إنا أحياي محيا محمد وآل محمد ومماتي إرادة محمد وآل محمد اللهم إنا ضائعون تبرك فينا مميز والراكبة اعتبار اللعين بالليل على لسانك ولسان نبيك صلى الله عليه وسلم في كل لمح وموقف وتفكير صلى الله عليه وسلم اللهم أعطى سفيان ومعاوية ويزيد بن معاوية عليهم من جلال كل دلال وضائعهم فرحت به يا وزيار وعلى تغفر والمسامين صلوات الله عليه اللهم فضائف عليهم النعماء بالجاه والعطاء اللهم اني اتمرد اليك في هذا اليوم وفي مغفرتي هذا وايام حياتي بالبراءة والذات عليهم وبالبراءة الذي كرام علينا وعليهم السلام اللهم محمد وغفرت عنده ولا ظالم اللهم العصابة التي جاءت حسن عليه السلام وشايعات وضايعات وتابعات اللهم أرض جميعا ما تمنى السلام عليك يا عبد الله وعلى الضراء التي أنفسنا عليك مني سلام الله وبركاته ما بقيت وبقي الليل والنهار ولا جعله الله واصلا عني زيارتكم السلام على الإنسان وعلى علي الإنسان وعلى أولاد الإنسان وعلى أصحاب الإنسان السلام على الإنسان وعلى علي الإنسان وعلى أولاد الإنسان وعلى أصحاب الإنسان اللهم خص أنت رمضان وابدأ به أولا ثم على الثاني والثالث والرابع اللهم من يزيد خامسا ونعم بين الله زيادا وابن رجالا وهو بسهل بشكرا قال ابي سفيان قال زيادا قال مهرا لا يغفر القيام. If possible, face the اللهم لك الحمد الشاكرين لك الصالحين الحمد لله على نعمته اللهم ارزقني شفاعة الحسين أحمد وثبتني ونبسر عندك على الحسين وأصحاب الحسين الذين بدوا وجنوا دون الحسين عليه السلام محمد وعلى محمد صلى اللهم صل على محمد وعلى محمد. صلى الله على محمد وعلى محمد اللهم صل. Brothers and sisters in Islam, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So just a couple of reminders inshallah before we begin. Like every night, please make sure that you had an opportunity to check in at the beginning. And if you haven't done that, inshallah, before we clear some time during the program, make sure that you do that. That way, God forbid, if there is a positive case, then we have the ability to contact trace and let everyone know who was present at the program. And then please make sure you have your mask on the entire time that you're in the two halls. If you're running out of breath or any of those things, always feel free to go outside for a little bit, catch your breath, and then come back inside. But inside, please make sure that you have a mask on at all times. Alhamdulillah, we're fortunate to have Sheikh Reza as our speaker for these events, and after unfortunate delay of this flight, he's here with us today. Please welcome him with a loud salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. صلى الله على محمد وعلى آله
الله وسلم.
اللهم صل على محمد.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. وبه نستعين إنه خير ناصر ومعين. والصلاة والسلام والتحية والإكرام على سيدنا ونبينا أبي القاسم محمد.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين. السلام عليك يا أبا عبد الله وعلى الأرواح التي حلت في فنائك. عليك مني سلام الله أبدا ما بقيت ولا جعله الله آخر لحظ مني لزيارتكم. نور ستيرة. السلام على المرسلين وعلى علي بن الحسين وعلى أولاد الحسين وعلى أصحاب الحسين وعلى 9 المعصومين من ذرية الحسين. صلى الله عليك يا أبا عبد الله. صلى الله عليك يا ابن رسول الله. يا ليتنا كنا معكم فنفوز معكم فوزا عظيما. صلوات.
اللهم صل على محمد.
Can everyone hear me without the microphone, or should we keep it? Keep the microphone. Okay. Please have a salawat.
اللهم صل على محمد.
It was adjusted for someone who's taller than me, so I'm just going to everyone for this. That's a lot.
اللهم صل على محمد.
I'd like to begin by first, of course, giving my salams to all of you. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi.
And of course, as well, on behalf of all of the crew members, the flight deck, and everyone who's involved in terms of the airline, I do apologize on behalf of all of them for the delay. I was supposed to be in yesterday, but because of that delay, I was unfortunately unable to join in the gathering here. And with that, I'd like to just begin by remembering and reminding ourselves of how much these gatherings that we are fortunate this year, alhamdulillah, that we're fortunate to have in person, how much we must appreciate and thank God for giving us this opportunity to gather. Now, it's one thing that, fortunately for various circumstances, for health and medical reasons, we're unable to gather. And that's part of the decree of God. But then at the same time, when God gives us back this ni'mah, this bounty and this blessing, then we must reappreciate that blessing. We must really fully appreciate the fact that we can gather in these majalis, and we can come together in brotherhood and sisterhood, and we can mourn the death and the martyrdom of Abu Abdullah. It's these gatherings, in fact, that the Ahlul Bayt have particularly focused on. From not just the Ahlul Bayt, the Imams who came after Imam Hassan. Of course, Imam Zain al-Abidin, Sayyid al-Sajidin, Ali ibn Hussein, alayhi salam, was renowned not only amongst his own companions, but all of Medina for being the person who would cry the most and profusely throughout his life. Imam Zain al-Abidin lived for decades after the events of Karbala, and yet until the final days of his life, until those final years of his life, Imam Zain al-Abidin would continue to commemorate that step, those events. Not just that, all of the Ahlul Bayt, until the Imam Hassan al-Askari would continuously remind their Shia to gather in these types of majalis. Now, it might seem to be, natural for the Ahlul Bayt to commemorate these majalis, to commemorate the death of Imam Hussein after the events of Karbala. But in fact, in our ahadith, we have reports from the Prophet himself, where the Prophet is commemorating and is crying and mourning the death of Imam Hussein. There are multiple, various different ahadith, various different reports, where the Prophet himself begins and he tells Lady Fatima, tells her about what will happen to her son. And the fact that there are going to be people after Imam Hussein has been killed, the people who would come together and gather and have assemblies commemorating his death. And that is the only reason why Lady Fatima has some sense of calm, because she is told by the Prophet that these people will come together and commemorate. In a hadith from our sixth Imam, Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq alayhi salam, says to one of his companions, Tajlisun wa tuhaddithun ya Fudayl, his companion by the name of Fudayl. The Imam says, do you gather and do you talk about our affair? Now, the affair of the Ahlul Bayt could be talking about their ahadith, could be talking about various different things. But the Imam cites something in particular. His companion says, yes, we gather and we talk about your ahadith, we gather and we discuss and we commemorate your ahadith and we remember them. And then he says, إِنَّ تِلْكَ الْمَجَالِسَ أُحِبُّهَا فَأَحْيُ أَمْرَنَا يَا فُضَيْلِ. Oh, Fudayl, these are the majalis that we love. And so enliven and revive our affair. فَرَحِمَ اللَّهُ مَنْ أَحْيَا أَمْرَنَا يَا فُضَيْلِ مَنْ ذَكَرَنَا أَوْ ذُكِرْنَا عِنْدَهُ فخرج من عينه مثل جناح الطباع غفر الله له ذنوبه ولو كانت أكثر من زبد البحر. He says, oh Fudayl, if in your gatherings, these are the gatherings that I love. This is Imam Sadiq saying, these are the gatherings that I love. And so gather in these events, come together in these different majalis so that you can enliven our affair. If there is anyone who mentions us, or it's in a gathering and we are mentioned in his presence, and just a small drop of tear, the smallest drop of tear that you can imagine. And the Imam gives the analogy, the image of the wing of a fly. So you can imagine how big that could be. Just the smallest tear drops from his eyes, then this person, God will forgive all of his sins, even if his sins were to cover all of the seas. And the Imam gives another image. He says, if his sins are like the foam on top of the seas. So you can imagine, the open seas, how much foam can gather on top of them. Imam says, as much foam or as large of an amount that you can imagine, Allah will forgive them. And so when we gather in these majalis, we should appreciate them. Yes, we can, of course, for those who can't make it, they can join in on virtually, but because God has given us this blessing of coming together and rekindling these bonds with each other, and as well shedding these tears and doing this aza for Imam Hussein, then we should take this more seriously, and we should take this with that hadith of Imam Sadiq in mind, that he, not only he, but through him, Allah loves these gatherings. Salawat. Now, when we talk about Imam Hussein, we talk about commemorating the tragedy of Karbala. Again, we're not talking about just an event that happened in history and that has passed. When we talk about Karbala, we talk about the most comprehensive event that occurred in Islam, an event that entails all of the various dimensions of Islam and revived all of those teachings of the Prophet. And this may be the reason why the ziyarat, the ahadith, continue to talk about making the ziyarat of Imam Hussein, of visiting Imam Hussein. In fact, when we look in, for example, Mafatih al-Jinan, you have the ziyarat of Imam Hussein recommended for every single day in the year. For those most important events, most important a'yad, those most important holidays throughout the Islamic calendar, we have a ziyarat of Imam Hussein. And this is very strange. This might seem very odd to us, whether it's, for example, Eid al-Fitr. Eid al-Adha, there is a ziyarat for Imam Hussein. When, for example, the 15th of Rajab, the beginning of Rajab, the 15th of Sha'ban, every single moment, every single momentous date in the Islamic calendar has a particular ziyarat that is dedicated to Imam Hussein. And then not only this, when we look in other ahadith, we see that the Ahlul Bayt and the Prophet himself tells us that it's not just, again, the people who come in the future. It's also the Prophet himself and all of the previous prophets who commemorate the tragedy of Karbala. And beyond this, all of the angels of God and even the jinn commemorate the tragedy of Imam Hussein. As we read in Ziyarat Ashura, even the heavens and the earth commemorate the tragedy of Imam Hussein. When we think about this, we have to think about, well, why is that? Why is it that it's not just something particular to the school of Ahlul Bayt, but it's something that all of God's creation, whether we consider them conscious or unconscious, whether we think that they know about the tragedy of Karbala or not, they all commemorate the tragedy of Karbala. When we think about this, we understand that the tragedy of Karbala is not just something historical, that's something that has happened in the past and that maybe some people will remember and maybe some people will forget. In fact, the tragedy of Karbala, the mission of Imam Hussein goes back to that very same mission of the Prophet of Islam. When we look in the Quran, for example, the Quran tells us what that mission is. In Surah An-Nisa, ayah number 170, Allah says, Ya ayyuhan nas, qad ja'akum ar-rasulu bil haqqi min rabbikum, fa aminu khayran lakum. O people, not again just particular to mu'mineen, not even to the Muslims. O people, it's a broad announcement to all who are listening, to all who are willing to listen. And even those who don't listen. It's interesting, the end of the ayah talks about وَإِن تَكْفُرُوا, those who don't listen, those who disbelieve. O you people, the Prophet has come with the truth, bil-haq. And I want to focus on this word today, haq. Min rabbikum. He has come with the truth from your Lord. فَآمِنُوا خَيْرًا لَكُمْ. And so believe and have faith in this truth. And this will be better for you. But, again, this is a broad message. وَإِن تَكْفُرُوا فَإِنَّ لِلَّهِ مَا فِي السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ. وَكَانَ اللَّهُ عَلِيمًا حَكِيمًا. And if you want to disbelieve, if you want to cover up the truth, then, well, God is not going to be harmed. إِنَّ لِلَّهِ مَا فِي السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ وَكَانَ اللَّهُ عَلِيمًا حَكِيمًا. God is not going to be harmed even the slightest. For God is all that is in the heavens and in the earth. And God is knowledgeable. He is the most knowledgeable and He is the most wise. He knows all of that which you kindle in your heart and all of that which you present in your actions. So we see that the message of Islam is not just a message about ethics. It's not just a message about politics. That the Prophet came and he united the Arabs, and then he was able to conquer a vast territory. And then from those conquests, then the Muslims later were able to conquer half of the known world. Yes, those are wonderful achievements. Those are wonderful accomplishments in Islamic history. Now, whether they were done justly or unjustly, that's a different story. But the fact that Islamic civilization was able to create some of the best, for example, artwork, some of the best philosophical minds, some of the best theology, and so on and so forth, those are wonderful, those are great, and those are noble achievements, and we should appreciate them. But we have to consider what was the mission of the Prophet from the very beginning? How does the Prophet himself and the Quran identify his mission? And that mission is identified by this word, al-haq. Now, haq in Arabic doesn't just talk about the truth. Haq also means reality. It also means the real world, the external world. And so if we think about what the Prophet is trying to teach, is those who listen and those who don't. He is trying to tell them that these are the laws of God, whether it is on the physical plane, on the moral plane, or on the spiritual plane. If you want to understand how God's laws and how God's sunnah work, how God's traditions, what are those causes and effects in the moral world, then these are the rules, and this is the map that you have to follow. And this is not just the truth, but this is reality. For anyone who is interested in reality, they must come and at least listen. And whether they accept or not, that's a different story. For anyone who is interested in reality, this is, according to the Prophet, what his message is conveying. And so when we think about the mission of Imam Hussein as reviving that message of the Prophet, the mission of Imam Hussein as calling back the Muslims, the Ummah of the Prophet, back to that message, then the mission of Imam Hussein is about the truth and about reality. And so when that voice of Imam Hussein is trampled, when it's quieted, and his body is trampled, that body is reflecting and symbolizing all of that truth, all of that reality that God has created, all of the things that we see around us, the heavens and the earth. And so as the ultimate reflection of the heavens and the earth, if the symbol of that reality is trampled, the symbol of the message of the Prophet is trampled, then it's no wonder that all of creation will be in tears. It's no wonder that all of creation will feel and will commemorate this tragedy. The mission of Imam Hussein was taking us back and guiding us to Allah Himself. And so if that mission, if that voice is silenced, then the entire purpose of creation has been for naught. And so all of creation will commemorate and will remember this tragedy. Sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And that is why when we look in the hadith of the Prophet himself, there's a strange hadith where the Prophet the hadith says that Angel Gabriel himself descends upon the Prophet. And he tells the Prophet about the story and the tragedy of Karbala. And then the Prophet takes the hand of Imam Ali and he goes into a secluded place where it is only them two, they're alone. And they begin to cry and they begin to weep. Again, this is something that's going to happen 50 years, at least 50 years after this event, this hadith, the moment, this context of this hadith. And the Prophet and Amir al-Mu'mineen begin to cry so much, and they cry for a large portion of the day, such that Angel Gabriel himself has to descend again with a message from God, where God says through the mouth of Angel Gabriel, gives him the salutations, and he says, I have commanded you to have patience. I've commanded you to bear this knowledge and this information that you have for a time. And that is the only moment. And it is at that moment that the Prophet and Amir al-Mu'mineen gains that ability to be patient in the face of this tragedy. Now, we mentioned the name of Amir al-Mu'mineen, and we mentioned some of the comprehensiveness of the events of Karbala. For the next few nights that I'm here with you all, I'd like to spend these nights talking about one of the important khutbahs of Amir al-Mu'mineen. This is khutbah number 192 of Nahj al-Balagha. Of course, depending on the different khutbahs, the different texts of Nahj al-Balagha, it's either 192 for those who would like to use the Farsi translation or who have access to that. And then in other texts, it has different numbers. The khutbah is called Khutbatul Qasa or Al-Khutbatul Qasa. And the reason why I'd like to spend a few nights discussing this khutbah is because this is one of the khutbahs of Nahj al-Balagha. It's first of all the longest khutbah, but also because this khutbah is one of the most comprehensive khutbahs within Nahj al-Balagha. It talks about so many of the different subjects that are contained within Nahj al-Balagha, but also that reflects on many of the issues that we maybe think about in these days. For example, we might think about the nature and why is it that God created evil in this world? Why is it that God not only allows evil to exist in this world, but allows it to thrive, such that the grandson of his prophet is able to be killed? What's the wisdom behind this? Why is it that God, for example, allows Shaitan to exist? And he gives him the ability to misguide his creation. Amir al-Mu'mineen talks about various of these different types of issues, many of which might come into our mind. And he talks about it in terms of a particular vice. Talks about it in terms of kibr and ta'azzuz, pride and vanity. This is khutbatul, it's again called al-khutbatul qasa. One of the reasons why it's called al-khutbatul qasa is because al-qasa refers to one of the meanings, one of the various meanings, refers to a camel that is chewing its cud. So for those who have seen a camel, sometimes it will have something in its stomach, and then it will throw this up. But whether it's whatever it might be digesting. It will throw this up, it will chew it, and then it will swallow it. It's not a very pleasant image, but regardless, for those, within the context of this khutbah, it was something that's very common in our day and age. Having that interaction, that close interaction with the natural world seems to be a little bit more distant. But for somebody who was living in Arabia at that time, this was something very, very common. What Amir al-Mu'mineen talks about in this khutbah is, he talks about kibr, vanity and pride, in such a way that he moves between talking and admonitions, admonishing those who are listening, and then censuring them for having this pride and this vanity. He moves between these different moments in this khutbah. So this is one of the reasons that is given for the naming of this khutbah. Another reason that's given is that in this khutbah, Amir al-Mu'mineen tries to crush. Again, another name for, another meaning for qasa'a or qasa'a is to crush. Like when you would, for example, crush lice or louse. And so Amir al-Mu'mineen in this khutbah, it is said that he's almost like trying to crush that vice within us, for those who are reading this khutbah. Trying to crush Iblis and his followers who have this pride. But the reason why I think this khutbah in particular can benefit us in these few nights is because the khutbah displays for us how the inner world and those inner beliefs, those inner vices and those inner virtues that we have are not just contained within us, but in fact, they are displayed in the outside world. It's through the way that we cultivate our inner selves, that we act in the world, and that we make the world reflect ourselves. And so when Amir al-Mu'mineen, for example, in this khutbah, inshallah, that we'll get the opportunity to talk about, Amir al-Mu'mineen talks about how individuals interact with each other. For example, he says, kibr and pride and vanity, self-conceit. This affects an individual on an individual level. This is a personal and a private vice that someone kindles within themselves, and it's an attack that Shaitan, Iblis, makes against. He attacks Banu Adam, the children of Adam, and he kindles this vice within them. And then Amir al-Mu'mineen shows how it's not just a personal vice. This vice, in fact, is the kernel and the root of all of the other evils that we see in our world. All of the other problems that we see in our societies, whether it's politically or even theologically. When we think about, for example, why is it that Shaitan himself, why is it that Shaitan turned away from God? It's because of this root of pride and vanity that Shaitan had within himself. And so Allah, by testing him, and by testing all of the angels, he's able to uncover this root of pride and vanity in him. And then the Imam says that Shaitan doesn't just limit this vice to himself. He says that this is the primary means, this is the primary trap that Shaitan sets for the Banu Adam, his ultimate enemies. فَإِنَّهَا مَسِيدَةُ إِبْلِيسَ الْعُظْمَى وَمَكِيدَتُهُ الْكُبْرَى. This is the ultimate trap, the greatest trap that Shaitan could set for his enemies. And it is that device, the greatest device that he could deploy. التي تصاور قلوب الرجال مصاورة السموم القاتلة فما تبقي أبدا ولا تشوي أحدا لا عالما لعلمه ولا مقلا في غمره. It is like a poison that seeps into the heart and it does not miss. So when we think about, for example, the depth of pride and vanity, it affects not just the individual, but it affects all of society and even the whole world. Right? When we, for example, reflect on our own society, we see that whether it's, disregarding because I think I have some additional knowledge that no one else has. It's disregarding certain protocols, or whether it is in terms of the environmental crisis that we are faced with. I think and I want this, and I have a right to this. This stems in its roots back to pride and vanity. Right? So the depth of this vice, the amount of harm that this can produce throughout the world, but as well the breadth of this vice. No one is safe from this trap. The Imam says this is a poison that seeps into the bloodstream of human beings, and it does not miss. And it does not have any refuge for any single individual. No one is protected from it. لا عالما لعلمه ولا مقلا في غمره. Neither is a scholar protected from it because he has some knowledge, nor even the most poor amongst us is protected from it. So it is both deep and it is broad. It affects every single person. And so in terms of the comprehensiveness and the ultimate effect of kibr, Amir al-Mu'mineen focuses on this vice. And then he goes into talking about all of these various issues, whether it is talking about the history of humankind, whether it is the source of all of the evil in God's creation. Why is it that God created Shaitan? And why did he let him thrive? And the various other topics that inshallah we can get to. Sallu ala Muhammad wa Now, because we don't have much time, I'd like to just focus on this idea of haqq, going back to the ayah of the Quran, where Allah says the message and the mission of the Prophet was to establish this haqq. Now, just in a few words. In this khutbah as well, Amir al-Mu'mineen also talks about his own position with the Prophet. Inshallah, if we get the opportunity, we can talk more about what Imam Ali actually says. And he describes for us that proximity that he has with the Prophet, how the Prophet raises Amir al-Mu'mineen, how he feeds him, how he lays him down in his own bed. He raises him from a young lad up to, when the Prophet passed away, and he was the most proximate person to the Prophet himself. And so when Amir al-Mu'mineen describes his claim, when we talk about Nahj al-Balagha, a lot of times you might think that Amir al-Mu'mineen, for example, he describes his claim towards the successorship of the Prophet as a succession that the Prophet had bestowed upon him. And he does in fact do this. He talks about it in terms of his haqq, his right. But when Amir al-Mu'mineen describes his relationship to the Prophet, he also is trying to tell us why is it that he is actually the rightful successor. And so Amir al-Mu'mineen says, that وَقَدْ عَلِمْتُمْ مَوْضَعِي مِنْ رَسُولِ اللَّهِ بِالْقَرَابَةِ الْقَرِيبَةِ. You know my position, my proximity to the Prophet. He took charge of me when I was only a child. And then he talks about, well, if you are thinking about the mission of the Prophet as bringing that haqq, from the time of his weaning, from the moment that the Prophet was a young child, Allah had put a mighty angel with him to take him along the path of high character and good behavior through day and night. So Amir al-Mu'mineen is describing the Prophet and how he acquires that mission. And then he says, if you want to think about, well, who should carry on this mission of the Prophet and this message of the Prophet, and who has that comprehensiveness to be able to carry on that message, then you have to look at the person who was raised by the Prophet in that same way. We think about the message of the Prophet and the mission of the Prophet, we see that the Prophet was one that God had taken on, raising him, giving him the path of high character and good behavior. And my relationship to the Prophet was like a young camel, following in the footprints of its mother. So if you think about, well, who is it that can carry on this mission? It can be no other than Amir al-Mu'mineen, because ultimately he is the one who has that comprehensive understanding of who the Prophet is, and as well that mission. Inshallah, we can talk more about this relationship of Amir al-Mu'mineen to truth. We have this famous hadith, Aliyun ma'al haq wal haqq ma'aliyin yaduru haythuma da. This is a very sort of difficult hadith to understand. Aliyun ma'al haq is understandable. Ali is with haq. If, as the school of the Ahlul Bayt, we understand that Imam Ali followed the truth and followed that mission of the Prophet wherever, at every point in his life, and in whatever context he found himself in. Wal haqqu ma Ali. Now, what does this mean? It's not just that the truth, that Imam Ali follows the truth, but the truth follows Imam Ali as well. What exactly is this relationship? Inshallah, we can talk about this tomorrow night. But let us turn our attention to Karbala. It is on a night like this, day, it is said on the third day, that the caravan of Imam Hussein reached the plains of Karbala. And when you think about what Imam Hussein knew, there is a hadith reported that when Imam Hussein came to the land, he was expecting something. He was looking for something. He was looking for those signs that his grandfather had told him. Again, we talked about how the Prophet of Allah was told by Angel Gabriel about the events of Karbala. In one hadith, it is said that when the Prophet saw Imam Hussein when he was a young infant, the Prophet took Imam Hussein in his arms, and he cradled the Imam, and he pressed him against himself, and he began to weep and he began to cry. When you think about the relationship of a grandfather to his grandson, not just a young boy, but an infant, there's no protection and no defense. The grandfather is the most loving person towards that infant's grandson. And so when those around the Prophet, when the wife of the Prophet saw this relationship, saw this interaction of the Prophet with his grandson, she was surprised. Usually when a grandfather holds his grandson, he is happy and he laughs and he plays with his grandson. And yet we see that the Prophet is crying and he's holding Imam Hussein close, and he's kissing the neck of Imam Hussein, and he's kissing the head of Imam Hussein, and he's kissing the body of Imam Hussein. And so the wife of the Prophet
asks him, what is it? What is going on? What is it that makes you cry so much, Ya Rasulullah? The Prophet says, I have been told by the angel Gabriel that one day my very ummah will come and will attack and will kill and will trample on this body. My own ummah will disgrace the haram of the prophets. My own ummah will do this against him. And so when Imam Hussein enters the plain of Karbala, he is remembering those signs that the Prophet had given him. And so when the caravan arrives to a place, Imam Hussein turns towards the people of that area and he begins to ask. He says, what is the name of this land? And each person gives one name. This place is called Nainawan. This place is called one name or another. The Imam is waiting for that sign that the Prophet has given him, that name that the Prophet has given him. And when finally someone says, this place also has another name, it is called Karbala, the Imam says, this is the place of trial and calamity. This is the place where our caravans will set their tents. This is the place where we will rest. This is the place where our blood will be spilled. This is the place where our graves will be dug. And then the Imam, it is said, in one report begins to outline the places where each person will fall. This is the place where Ali ibn Akbar will fall. This is the place where Abbas will have his hands cut. This is the place where I will bury my own infant son. But that day has not come yet. It is on a day like this when the caravan has arrived on those plains. It said that Lady Zainab, when her camel stops, she sees that all of Banu Hashim has surrounded her. She has all of this help to help her unload and come down from the camel. She sees that Ali Akbar comes and helps her. Qasim is there. Abbas is there. When Imam Hussein needs anything, he is setting up his tent. Abbas is there to help him. When he is doing one thing or another, the companions of Imam Hussein are helping him and assisting him. But only in a few days, when Imam Hussein looks around him and he sees the companions and the bodies of his companions and his family members lying on the plains of Karbala, he calls out and he says, where are you now? It is only in a few days when Lady Zainab looks around her. And it is the moment when she is preparing to leave Karbala. After Imam Hussein's body has fallen, she looks to that body and she says, Ya Muhammad, wa banatika sabaya. Wa Muhammad, oh Muhammad, and look, your daughters are in chains and they are in prison, and your progeny has been killed. And look, this is the body of your grandson on the floor, on the sands of Karbala. Blood all over his body. His head cut. And no one to help him.
وسيعلم الذين ظلموا أي منقلب ينقلبون إنا لله وإنا إليه راجعون.
Ya Hussein, Ya Hussein, Ya Hussein,
Ya Hussein, Ya Hussein, Ya Hussein. Karbala, Karbala, Karbala hai, Karbala, 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 Karbala hai, Karbala. जाने वाले Karbala के Karbala ले चल मुझे, 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 रोज़ा-ए शबीर पर घूमूंगा दीवाने चल मुझे, जाने वाले Karbala ले चल मुझे, जाने वाले Karbala ले चल मुझे, है जहाँ गंगे शहीदा, है जहाँ लहरे कुरान, है जहाँ गंगे शहीदा, है जहाँ लहरे कुरान, जिस जगह सैयद मेरा प्यारा सारा ले चल मुझे, जाने वाले Karbala ले चल मुझे, जाने वाले Karbala ले Karbala ले चल मुझे, जिस जगह जाती की किस्मत भुरकी वो देखूंगा मैं, जिस जगह जाती की किस्मत भुरकी वो देखूंगा मैं, आसियों पर कैसे होती है अता ले चल मुझे, जाने वाले Karbala के Karbala ले चल मुझे, जाने वाले Karbala के Karbala ले चल मुझे, इस कदर नादार हूँ साथी सबर कुछ भी नहीं, इस कदर नादार हूँ साथी सबर कुछ भी नहीं, दोष पर अपने बिठा कर मैं हवाले चल मुझे, जाने वाले Karbala के Karbala ले चल मुझे, जाने वाले Karbala के Karbala ले चल मुझे, जिस जगह पास के बाजू करम हो करके, जिस जगह पास के बाजू करम हो करके, उस जगह मैं भी करूँ मातम जरा ले चल मुझे, जाने वाले Karbala ले चल मुझे, जाने वाले Karbala के Karbala ले चल मुझे, दिल उलझ कर आ गया बरछी में अकबर का जमां, दिल उलझ कर आ गया बरछी में अकबर का जमां, दिल वहाँ मैं भी करूँ अपना फिदा ले चल मुझे, जाने वाले Karbala के Karbala ले चल मुझे, जाने वाले Karbala के Karbala ले चल मुझे, जल गए शामे गरीबा में जहाँ पर जलाले चल मुझे जाने वाले करबला के चल मुझे जाने वाले करबला के चल मुझे हाय वो मक्तल जहाँ बाकी सकीना रात में हाय वो मक्तल जहाँ बाकी सकीना रात में टूटती किसी ना बाप जाए चल मुझे जाने वाले करबला ले चल मुझे जाने वाले करबला ले चल मुझे जाने वाले करबला के करबला ले चल मुझे जाने वाले करबला के करबला ले चल मुझे शबीर करूंगा दुआएं चल मुझे जाने वाले करबला के करबला ले चल मुझे Oh my master, Mola Hussein. 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 My master from the sea instead of water, it was Sallallahu alayka ya Hussein. Oh my master, Mola 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 Hussein. The other side is no Abbas. Then yellow of the earth and the skies. The thirsty flag bearer of Hussein. Sallallahu alayka ya Hussein. Oh my master, Mola 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 Hussein. صلى الله عليك يا يا عبد الله أرجع يا الناس برسيني الخور تماسين زمين سینه‌اش خرد شد سینه زنم کرد حسین آی مثل امروزی زینب کبرا وارد کربلا شد عقیده بنی هاشم رو با احترام پیاده کردم عباس اکبر قاسم جوانان بنی هاشم داره کردنم اما جناب سوره وقتی زینب روز 11 خواست سوار محمد بشه نه محرمی نه جوانی نه اکبری نه عباسی اسمك الرمين الأقرب بدم المنعوم من كربلاء عبد الله وبحق زينب الكبرى يا الله 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 يا رحمن يا رحيم يا مقلب القلوب ثبت قلوبنا على دينك وعلى محبة الحسين في الدنيا واكفنا يا باقي الوفاء ويا كافي المنى إنك مجيب الدعوات إنك غافر الذنب والخطيئة إنك على كل شيء قدير. There are two people from our community that they're suffering from COVID-19. One is Brother Matthew, who's in a very bad condition, and Sister Sabrina, sister of Brother Masood. Just remember all those who are sick, especially these two people in your mind. Let's raise our hand. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. ما يجيب رحم الله من يقرأ الفاتحة حسنا